They found the ship on a Tuesday morning when the tide was low and the air tasted like rust and salt. Nobody was supposed to be there. The island had been declared secured 3 weeks prior, marked on the maps with a blue circle that meant safe, cleared, forgotten. But Sergeant James Carter knew better than to trust maps. He'd learned that lesson at Guadalcanal when a supposedly empty village had cost them 2 good men and a week of sleepless nights. The squad had been sent out to retrieve supplies from a downed transport plane, a routine assignment that should have taken 4 hours. Instead, they'd been hiking through jungle thick enough to choke sunlight for 6 hours, following coordinates that kept shifting every time Carter checked the compass. Private Eddie Walsh blamed the humidity for throwing off the readings. Corporal Marcus Hayes blamed the Navy for giving them bad intel in the first place. Carter blamed himself for not questioning the orders sooner. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The jungle opened without warning, the way it sometimes did in the Philippines. Wall of green giving way to a crescent of gray sand and broken coral. The squad stopped at the tree line, instinct holding them back even though the beach looked empty. Carter raised his fist. 6 men froze behind him, rifles ready, eyes scanning for movement. The heat pressed down like a wet blanket. Somewhere behind them, a bird made a sound like rusty hinges. That's when Private Tommy Chen pointed toward the water. The ship sat crooked in the shallows about 200 yards out, listing to starboard at an angle that made it look drunk. It was small by Navy standards, maybe 100 feet stem to stern, the kind of coastal freighter the Japanese used to move supplies between islands. The hull was painted a dull gray that had blistered and peeled in the sun, and the mast tilted at an angle that suggested either a storm or a collision. No flag, no smoke, no sign of life. Carter pulled out his binoculars, the leather strap hot against his neck. He studied the deck first, looking for movement, for the glint of a rifle scope, for anything that might indicate an ambush. Nothing. The ship looked dead, abandoned, like something that had washed up from another war entirely. But something about it made his stomach tight. "How long you think it's been there, Sarge?" Walsh asked quietly. He was 19, from Boston, and still had a habit of whispering even when there was no reason to. Hard to say. Carter lowered the binoculars. Could be days. Could be weeks. Hayes moved up beside him, his Thompson balanced across his forearms. "Should we call it in?" Carter checked his watch. They were already 3 hours overdue. The radio had been giving them static since noon, probably another casualty of the humidity and the mountains between them and base. They could turn around, trek back through the jungle, report the ship, and let someone else deal with it. That would be by the book. That would be safe. But Carter had seen the way headquarters handled reports from their squad. Paperwork got filed. Promises got made. Then nothing happened. They were good enough to haul supplies and dig latrines, but when it came to actual reconnaissance, to decisions that mattered, the orders went to other units. Units with different faces. "We check it out," Carter said. "Quick sweep. If it's clear, we mark it and move on." Nobody argued. They never did. That was one thing he could count on. This collection of men nobody else wanted in their squad. Walsh with his stutter, Chen with his grandmother's letters that he read every night, Hayes with his engineering degree that the Army pretended not to notice, Jackson with the scar across his throat from a bar fight in Georgia, Williams with his Bible and his quiet way of watching everything, and Lewis, who never spoke about what he'd done before the war but sometimes woke up screaming. They moved down the beach in a loose formation, boots sinking in sand that was darker than it should have been, almost black in places. The sun hammered down. The water beyond the ship was the color of old glass, green and murky, and Carter could see shapes moving beneath the surface, fish or maybe something else. The smell hit them when they were 50 yards out, the unmistakable stench of decay mixing with oil and seawater. "Jesus," Walsh muttered, pulling his collar up over his nose. The ship loomed larger as they approached, its shadow falling across them like a bruise. Up close, Carter could see the damage more clearly. The hull had been breached near the waterline, a jagged hole big enough to drive a jeep through, the metal peeled back like a tin can. Rust streaked down the sides in patterns that looked almost deliberate. The deck was littered with debris, rope and shattered crates, and something that might have been a tarp, or might have been clothing. "Chen Lewis, secure the beach," Carter ordered. "Rest of you on me." They waded into the water, rifles held high. The current pulled at their legs, stronger than it looked, and the bottom was uneven, studded with coral that could slice through boot leather if you weren't careful. Carter reached the hull first, pressing his palm against the metal. It was hot enough to hurt. He could feel the throb of trapped air inside, a hollow resonance that reminded him of an empty church. A rope ladder hung from the deck rail, half-rotted but still intact. Hayes tested it first, his weight making the whole thing creak and sway. Then he climbed, hand over hand, rifle slung across his back. Carter followed, Walsh behind him, trying not to think about how exposed they were. How easy it would be for someone hidden in the ship's interior to cut them down before they reached the top. But nothing moved. No shots rang out. No voices called in Japanese or English or any language at all. The deck was worse than it had looked from the beach. Blood, old and brown, stained the planks in irregular patterns. Bullet holes stitched across the wheelhouse windows. A boot lay on its side near the railing, empty, the leather cracked and faded. The whole ship tilted at an angle that made walking difficult, every step a small negotiation with gravity. Hayes moved toward the wheelhouse, weapon ready. Carter checked the cargo hold, a square hatch secured with a rusted padlock. The metal was Japanese, stamped with characters he couldn't read. He tried the lock, solid, Walsh, bolt cutters. The private unslung his pack, fumbled for the tools. His hands were shaking. Carter didn't comment. They were all shaking, even if they didn't show it. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Ships didn't just appear on secured islands. Crews didn't vanish without bodies or lifeboats or some sign of what had happened. The bolt cutters snapped through the lock with a sound like breaking teeth. Carter lifted the hatch. The smell that rushed out made Walsh gag and turn away. But it wasn't the smell of bodies. It was something else, something chemical and sweet, like old paper burning. Below, a ladder descended into darkness. Carter pulled out his flashlight, clicked it on, aimed the beam down. Crates, dozens of them, maybe more, stacked floor to ceiling in the hold, each one marked with red characters that stood out like fresh blood against the pale wood. "Sarge," Hayes called from the wheelhouse, "you need to see this." Carter turned, but something made him look back at the hold, at those crates sitting in the dark like secrets waiting to be opened. His gut told him to walk away. His gut told him that whatever was down there, whatever had been important enough to seal behind a lock on an abandoned ship, was something they weren't meant to find. But he'd never been good at walking away. "What you got?" he called to Hayes, still staring down into the hold. Logbook. Hayes emerged from the wheelhouse holding a water-damaged notebook. "It's in English, Sarge. Some of it anyway. Looks like manifest records, cargo transfers, and something else." "What else?" Hayes met his eyes, and Carter saw something there he didn't like. Something that looked like fear. Prisoner transfer orders. Dated 3 weeks ago. American names. The air seemed to stop moving. Carter looked back at the hold, at those crates stacked in the dark, and felt something cold spread through his chest. Prisoner transfers didn't come on cargo ships. They came on military transports with escorts and paperwork and official oversight. And they definitely didn't come to islands that had been declared secured and forgotten. "Open one," Carter said quietly. "Sarge, we should call this in first. Open one." Walsh climbed down first, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Carter followed, his boots hitting the deck with a hollow thud. The hold was bigger than it had looked from above, stretching back into shadows that the flashlight couldn't quite reach. The crates were military issue, American military issue, the kind used to transport everything from ammunition to medical supplies. Carter found a crowbar wedged between 2 crates. He worked it under the lid of the nearest box, the wood groaning as he pried. The nails came free with a shriek. Walsh aimed his light at the opening. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, bundled in string, some still in envelopes, others loose and water-stained. Carter reached in, pulled one out. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough. "Dear Mom," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I made it home. It means the war is over and I'm coming back to you. Please don't cry. Please don't worry anymore. I'm alive. I'm coming home." The signature at the bottom was barely legible, but Carter could make out the name. Private David Morrison, Company B, 141st Infantry. Carter's hands were steady as he opened another letter, then another, each one the same. Each one written by a soldier the Army had declared missing in action. Each one a promise to come home. Walsh made a sound in his throat, something between a gasp and a sob. Carter set the letters down carefully, like they might break. Then he turned to the next crate, the one marked with a red cross and Japanese characters he was starting to understand, even though he couldn't read them. He already knew what he'd find inside. Personal effects, dog tags, photographs, wedding rings, everything the dead left behind, except these men weren't supposed to be dead. They were supposed to be coming home. Hayes appeared at the top of the ladder, his face pale in the shadows. "Sarge, we got a problem. Radio's working again. HQ's calling us back. They want to know our position, and they're asking about the ship." Carter looked around the hold, at the crate stretching back into darkness, at the letters scattered at his feet, at the evidence of something that shouldn't exist piled up like cargo waiting to be delivered. "How do they know about the ship?" he asked quietly. Hayes swallowed. "That's what I'm asking myself, Sarge. That's exactly what I'm asking myself." Carter stared at Hayes for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. The radio static crackled from somewhere above deck, distorted voices cutting through the silence of the hold. He looked down at the letters scattered around his boots, then back at Hayes, standing at the top of the ladder, backlit by the brutal Philippine sun. "Tell them we're investigating a possible munitions cache," Carter said. "Tell them we need another hour." Hayes hesitated. "Sarge, if they already know about the ship, then we've got an hour before they send someone to make sure we don't find what we're not supposed to find. Move." Hayes disappeared. Walsh stood frozen beside Carter, his flashlight beam trembling across the crates. The kid was breathing too fast, the kind of breathing that came before panic or vomiting or both. Carter put a hand on his shoulder, squeezed once. "Stay with me, Private. I need you focused." Walsh nodded, swallowed hard. "What are we looking for, Sarge?" Carter didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer. What were they looking for in a hold full of dead men's letters, on a ship that shouldn't exist, on an island that was supposed to be empty? He moved deeper into the hold, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing more crates stacked 3 high against the bulkheads. The next crate he opened contained photographs, hundreds of them, loose and water-damaged, faces staring up from the bottom of a wooden box like ghosts. Carter picked one up carefully. A young soldier couldn't have been more than 20, standing beside a woman in a floral dress, both of them smiling. On the back, in pencil, "Me and Sarah, June 1943. The handwriting matched one of the letters. Walsh opened another crate. This one held dog tags, dozens of them, tangled together like metal weeds. He let them slip through his fingers, the tags clicking against each other. Each one stamped with a name and a serial number and a blood type, each one belonging to someone who was supposed to be missing, not dead, not forgotten in the hold of a Japanese cargo ship. "How many?" Walsh whispered. "How many are there?" Carter moved to the manifest Hayes had found, now lying on top of one of the crates. The pages were brittle, stained with salt water and something that might have been blood. The handwriting switched between English and Japanese, between military precision and hurried scrawl. He flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening with each entry. "Prisoner transfer, October 12th, 1944. 43 names. Camp designation, Mindanao Station 7. Another entry, January 1945. 62 names, March, April, May." The numbers climbed. The dates got closer to the present, and then, on the last page with writing, dated 3 weeks ago, a single line in English. "Final evacuation. All remaining personnel. Authorization, Allied Command, Pacific Theater." Carter read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't change. Walsh was opening more crates now, moving with mechanical precision, Like if he kept his hands busy, his mind couldn't catch up with what they were finding. Medical records, debriefing notes, transfer orders with signatures that had been blacked out, and more letters. Always more letters. Each one a voice crying out from the dark. Footsteps on the deck above. Jackson appeared at the hatch opening, his face grim. Sarge, HQ's getting insistent. They want us to report in 15 minutes with a full assessment. And Lewis spotted something you need to see. On the beach. Carter looked around the hold one more time. They'd barely scratched the surface. There were at least 30 more crates they hadn't opened, maybe more in the shadows at the back. Each one potentially holding more evidence of whatever had happened here, whatever had gone so wrong that it needed to be hidden on an abandoned ship on a forgotten island. "Secure this hold," he told Walsh. "Don't let anyone else down here until I get back. And Private, if I give the order, you burn every piece of paper in this hold. You understand?" Walsh's eyes went wide. "Sarge, you understand?" "Yes, sir." Carter climbed the ladder, his legs heavy, his mind racing. The heat hit him like a physical thing when he reached the deck, the sun reflecting off the metal so bright it hurt. Hayes was at the railing with the radio, his voice tight as he fed headquarters some story about structural damage and potential hazards. Williams stood guard by the wheelhouse, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the tree line. Jackson led Carter to the beach where Lewis and Chen had set up a perimeter. Lewis was crouched in the sand, his hand hovering over something Carter couldn't quite see. Chen stood a few feet back, his rifle pointed at the jungle, but his attention kept drifting to whatever Lewis had found. "Show me," Carter said. Lewis pointed. "Fresh tracks, Sarge. Boot prints, military issue, U.S. military issue." He traced the outline with his finger. Size 10, maybe 11. Deep impression means he was carrying weight. "And look here." He moved his hand to show a pattern in the sand. He stopped right here, stood for a while, then went back into the jungle, single file, trying to hide his trail. When? Lewis checked the sand, the way the edges of the print had started to soften in the wind. 6 hours ago, maybe 8. Before we got here. Carter felt his chest tighten. Someone had been here. Someone wearing American boots, moving like American military, watching the ship. And then they'd left, disappeared back into the jungle without making contact, without identifying themselves, without doing anything except observe and retreat. "Hayes," Carter called. "Any mention of other patrols in this sector?" Hayes shook his head. "We're supposed to be the only ones out here, Sarge. Island's been marked clear for 3 weeks. "Supposed to be," Carter repeated. He looked at the jungle, at the wall of green that could hide a platoon or a single sniper or nothing at all. His instincts were screaming now, the same instincts that had kept him alive through Guadalcanal and Saipan and a dozen other islands that had tried to kill him. This was a trap. Not the obvious kind, not the kind with tripwires and machine guns, but the kind that was worse, the kind that came with orders and oversight and plausible deniability. "We need to move," Jackson said quietly. "If someone's watching, we need to document," Carter interrupted. "Everything in that hold. Every letter, every name, every piece of evidence. We need photos. We need copies. Because once we report this, once we tell headquarters what we found, this ship is going to disappear. And everyone in that hold is going to disappear with it." The squad fell silent. They all knew what he was saying without him having to spell it out. This was bigger than them, bigger than their squad, bigger than this island, maybe bigger than anyone wanted it to be. Prisoner transfers that weren't in any official record. Dog tags from men who were supposed to be missing, not dead. Letters that would never be delivered, and Allied command authorization on a Japanese ship. Williams spoke up, his voice calm and measured. "Sarge, with respect, we're talking about disobeying direct orders. We're talking about withholding intelligence from headquarters. That's court-martialed territory." Carter met his eyes. "I know exactly what we're talking about, Corporal. And you're saying we do it anyway. I'm saying we do our job. Our job is reconnaissance. Our job is to observe, document, and report. And right now, what I'm observing is that headquarters wants us off this ship before we see too much." He gestured toward the hold. Those men down there, those letters, those families waiting for someone to come home. They deserve better than a cover-up and a closed file. Hayes climbed down from the deck, the radio slung over his shoulder. HQ's giving us 30 minutes, Sarge. After that, they're sending a chopper. And they specifically said to secure the area and wait. Not investigate. Secure and wait. Then we've got 30 minutes, Carter said. Chen, Williams, you're on perimeter. Anyone comes up that beach, anyone comes out of that jungle, you call it. Jackson, you're with me. We're cataloging everything in that hold. Hayes, you keep feeding HQ delays. Equipment failure, structural concerns, whatever you need to say. Walsh and Lewis start photographing. Every document, every letter, everything. Nobody moved for a second. This was the moment. This was where they decided whether they were going to be soldiers who followed orders or men who did what was right. Sometimes those were the same thing. Sometimes they weren't. Lewis was the first to move. He pulled out a camera from his pack, the kind they used for reconnaissance photos. Then Hayes. Then Jackson. One by one, the squad fell into motion, each man making his choice without a word being spoken. They worked in near silence, the only sounds the click of the camera and the rustle of paper and the occasional muttered curse when someone found something particularly damning. Carter moved through the hold like a man possessed, opening crates, reading names, committing faces to memory. Private Thomas Sullivan, Brooklyn. Corporal James Chen, San Francisco. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, Chicago. On and on, a roll call of the missing and the presumed dead. Walsh found a crate filled with medical records. Carter scanned them quickly, his flashlight beam moving across pages of Japanese and English mixed together. Dysentery, malnutrition, tuberculosis, injuries from forced labor. The conditions described were worse than anything the Geneva Convention allowed. And at the bottom of each record, a stamp in red ink, a Japanese character that Carter was beginning to recognize. Transferred. Not dead. Not executed. Transferred. To where, the records didn't say. But the dates lined up. Every prisoner listed as transferred matched a dog tag in the hold. Every dog tag matched a letter, and every letter matched a name on the Allied command manifest. Sarge, Jackson called from the back of the hold. You need to see this. Carter made his way through the maze of crates to where Jackson stood beside a locked metal trunk, half hidden behind a stack of supply boxes. The lock was different from the others, newer, and it had English writing stamped on the side. Property of U.S. Army Intelligence, Pacific Theater. That's not supposed to be here, Carter said quietly. No, sir, it's not. They stared at the trunk for a long moment. Whatever was inside, it had been placed there deliberately, hidden among the Japanese cargo, protected by an American lock. This wasn't captured equipment. This wasn't war salvage. This was something that had been put here by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Hayes appeared at Carter's shoulder. Sarge, we got a problem. Radio just crackled something about authorized personnel only and immediate evacuation. They're not asking anymore. They're telling how long. Choppers inbound, 20 minutes, maybe less. Carter looked at the trunk, then at the crates surrounding them, at the hundreds of letters and photographs and dog tags that represented hundreds of families who deserved to know the truth. 20 minutes wasn't enough. 20 hours wouldn't be enough. Get that trunk open, he told Jackson. I don't care how. Walsh, are we getting photos? Almost done, Sarge. Then finish and get topside. Everyone except Jackson, out of the hold in 10 minutes. We're going to look like we followed orders. We're going to look like good soldiers who secured an area and waited for backup. But before that chopper touches down, I want copies of everything that matters. And I want that trunk open. Jackson was already working on the lock with a tension wrench and a pick, his hands steady despite the sweat running down his face. The others scrambled to finish their documentation, cameras clicking, papers rustling, the seconds ticking down like a countdown to something none of them could quite name. The lock clicked open. Jackson lifted the lid slowly, carefully, like he was defusing a bomb. Inside were files, official files, bound in leather covers, marked with stamps and signatures that Carter recognized even from a distance. intelligence reports, debriefing transcripts, communication logs between Allied command and Japanese officials, and at the very bottom, a single folder marked in red letters. Operation Homecoming, classified, eyes only. Carter reached for the folder, his hands steadier than they should have been. He opened it, read the first page, then the second. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very cold, very still. Jackson leaned in, trying to read over his shoulder. "Sarge, what is it?" Carter closed the folder carefully. Then he looked at Jackson, and when he spoke, his voice was flat, empty of everything except the weight of what he'd just read. "Get everyone topside. Now. We're going to wait for that chopper like good soldiers. We're going to tell them we found an abandoned ship with some old cargo, and we're going to forget we were ever here. But Sarge, the letters, the names. We're never here," Carter said. "Because if anyone finds out what's in this trunk, if anyone confirms what those files say, it won't just be us going down. It'll be everyone, every family waiting for word, every soldier still out there hoping for rescue. The whole thing will disappear, and no one will ever know the truth." The sound of rotor blades began to echo across the water, distant but growing closer. The chopper was early. Of course it was early. They'd probably been watching the whole time, waiting to see how much the squad would find, how much they would figure out. Carter tucked the folder inside his jacket. It was thin enough to hide, small enough to smuggle past a casual inspection. The rest of the trunk he left open, the other files scattered like they'd been examined and dismissed. "Upstairs," he called. "Everyone, move." They climbed out of the hold one by one, leaving behind the crates and the letters and the evidence of something that the official record would say never happened. The sun was lower now, the shadows longer, and the sound of the helicopter was growing louder, closer, inevitable. Carter was the last to emerge. He stood on the deck for a moment, looking back at the open hatch, at the darkness below, at all those voices calling out from the hold. Then he closed the hatch, fastened it, and turned to face his squad. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "we were never here. We found nothing. The ship was empty, you understand. They understood. They always understood. That was the thing about being invisible. You learned to see things no one else wanted you to see, and you learned to keep your mouth shut about it." The helicopter appeared over the tree line, black against the orange sky, and Carter stood at attention with his squad beside him, waiting to be told what good soldiers they were for following orders. The helicopter touched down on the beach in a storm of sand and noise, the rotors beating the air like angry fists. 2 officers emerged before the blades stopped spinning, their uniforms too clean for men who'd spent any time in the field. Behind them came 4 MPs with rifles and hard faces. Carter counted 6 men total, which was 4 more than necessary for a routine inspection. The lead officer was a major, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of walk that said he'd spent more time behind desks than in combat. His name tape read Hensley. The other was a captain, younger, nervous, his hand resting on his sidearm like he expected trouble. "Sergeant Carter," Major Hensley called over the rotor wash. His voice was flat, businesslike. "Report." Carter saluted, his face blank. "Abandoned Japanese cargo vessel, sir. Approximately 100 feet. Hull breached, listing to starboard. No personnel aboard. Preliminary sweep shows general supply cargo. Nothing of strategic value." Hensley studied him for a long moment, his eyes moving from Carter's face to the ship behind him to the squad standing at attention. "You've been aboard?" "Yes, sir. Standard reconnaissance protocol." "How long?" "Approximately 40 minutes, sir." 40 minutes. Hensley pulled out a notepad, flipped it open. "And in those 40 minutes, what exactly did you find?" Carter felt the folder pressing against his ribs under his jacket. The paper was thin, but it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "Supply crates," he said. "Medical supplies, mostly expired. Some personal effects, standard issue Japanese gear. Nothing classified. You opened the hold. Standard procedure, sir, and photographed the contents." Carter hesitated just long enough to let Hensley know the answer before he spoke. "Yes, sir. Reconnaissance documentation. for intelligence assessment. Where are those photographs now? Hayes stepped forward, holding up the camera. Here, sir. Undeveloped, as per protocol. Hensley held out his hand. The captain behind him shifted, his nervous energy infecting the beach. Hayes looked at Carter, who nodded once. The camera changed hands. Hensley didn't even look at it before passing it back to one of the MPs. You found nothing else, Hensley said. It wasn't a question. No, sir. No documents. No manifests. No records of any kind. Just cargo, sir. Empty crates mostly. Water damage throughout. Hensley closed his notepad with a snap that sounded too loud in the sudden quiet after the helicopter shut down. Sergeant, I'm going to be very clear with you. This vessel is now under military intelligence jurisdiction. You and your men are to return to base immediately. You will not discuss what you found here. You will not file a report. You will not speak to anyone about this operation. Do you understand? Carter met his eyes. With respect, sir, we found an abandoned enemy vessel in a secured zone. That requires a full reconnaissance report. No, Hensley interrupted. It doesn't. Because this vessel was already known to intelligence. Because your presence here was a mistake. Because you were never supposed to find this ship. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jackson shifted behind Carter, a small movement that said he was ready to act if things went sideways. Walsh had gone very still. Hayes was staring at the major like he'd just spoken a foreign language. Sir, Carter said carefully, are you ordering us to falsify our mission report? I'm ordering you to follow protocol for classified operations, Hensley said, which means you witnessed nothing classified and therefore have nothing to report beyond routine patrol activity. Is that clear, Sergeant? Behind Hensley, the MPs had moved into a loose semicircle, not quite threatening but not friendly either. The captain had his hand fully on his pistol now, his eyes darting between the squad and the ship like he was waiting for someone to make a wrong move. Carter felt the weight of 6 sets of eyes on his back. His squad, his responsibility. The folder under his jacket felt like it was burning through his shirt. Operation Homecoming. The words he'd read in those files kept echoing in his head. Prisoner exchange, negotiated terms, official authorization. And underneath all the bureaucratic language, one simple truth that made his stomach turn. Some of those men were alive. Some of those prisoners whose letters filled that hold, whose dog tags were tangled in boxes, whose families were waiting for them to come home. They were alive, and someone had decided they would stay missing. Crystal clear, sir? Carter said. Good. Hensley gestured to the MPs. Escort the sergeant and his men back to their transport. Make sure they have everything they need for immediate departure. The MPs moved in, not aggressive but firm, positioning themselves around the squad. One of them, a corporal with a scar across his jaw, caught Carter's eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. A warning. As they were being herded toward the tree line, Carter looked back at the ship one more time. The captain was already climbing aboard with 2 of the MPs. They'd be in the hold in minutes. They'd find the open trunk, the scattered files, the evidence that someone had been digging deeper than they should have, but they wouldn't find the folder. Carter had that. The question was what he was going to do with it. The march back through the jungle was silent except for the sounds of boots on vegetation and the occasional bird call. The MPs stayed close, but not too close, maintaining a professional distance that somehow felt more threatening than if they'd been openly hostile. They knew. Not what, maybe, but they knew something had been found, something that mattered, something that their orders were to contain. Carter's mind raced as they walked. He could feel every step taking him further from the ship, further from the evidence, further from the moment where he might have made a different choice. But what choice? Pull the folder out, wave it in Hensley's face, demand answers. That would last about 30 seconds before the MPs took it from him, and he spent the rest of the war in a military prison. Or worse. Give the folder to his commanding officer when they got back to base. Another dead end. Officers talked to other officers. Reports got filed up the chain. And somewhere along that chain, someone would make the folder disappear, just like they were making the ship disappear. No. If this was going to mean anything, if those men in the hold were going to have any chance, Carter needed to get the folder somewhere it couldn't be buried. Somewhere public, somewhere that mattered. The problem was he had no idea where that somewhere was. They reached the transport truck an hour after leaving the beach, the same 6x6 that had dropped them off that morning, in what felt like another lifetime. The MPs watched as the squad loaded their gear, their eyes never leaving Carter. One of them, the corporal with the scar, stepped close as Carter climbed into the back. "Smart move back there," he said quietly, walking away. Carter looked at him. "You were on the ship before." "This morning. Those were your boot prints." The corporal's face didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about. You stood there for 8 hours, watching, waiting to see if we'd find it." The corporal glanced at his fellow MPs, then back to Carter. His voice dropped even lower. "Whatever you think you know, Sergeant, forget it, for your own good. They're cleaning that ship right now. By tomorrow, it'll be scuttled in deep water. And anyone who asks too many questions about it will find themselves transferred to the quietest, most forgotten outpost in the Pacific. You get me? I get you. Then we're done here." The corporal stepped back, and the truck engine rumbled to life. As they pulled away, Carter twisted to look through the canvas covering. The jungle was already swallowing the path they'd taken. By nightfall, you'd never know anyone had been there at all. Back at base, they were separated immediately. Different debriefings, different rooms, different officers asking the same questions in slightly different ways. "What did you see? What did you find? Did you take anything from the ship?" Carter answered each question the same way. "Nothing classified, sir. Just an abandoned vessel. Standard reconnaissance procedures followed. They kept him for 6 hours. By the time they released him, his squad had already been dismissed, sent back to their barracks with the same warnings Hensley had given on the beach. Don't talk. Don't ask questions. Forget you were there." Carter found them in the mess hall, picking at food none of them wanted to eat. They looked up when he approached, their faces showing the strain of the day. No one spoke at first. The mess hall was full of other soldiers, other ears, other eyes that might be watching. Hayes broke the silence. "We good, Sarge. We're good," Carter said. It was a lie, but it was the lie they needed to hear. Walsh opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it. Williams stared at his tray. Jackson met Carter's eyes and saw something there that made him nod once, sharp and final. They all knew this wasn't over. But they also knew they couldn't talk about it here. Later, after dark, Carter lay in his bunk and pulled out the folder. He'd hidden it in his footlocker, wrapped in an oilcloth beneath spare socks and letters from home. The pages crinkled as he opened it, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet barracks. He read it again, slower this time, making sure he hadn't missed anything. Operation Homecoming. Negotiated prisoner exchange. Japanese command willing to release certain POWs in exchange for diplomatic considerations post-surrender. List of names. 3 pages of names. Men who were supposed to come home. Men whose families had been told they were missing, presumed dead, when in fact they were very much alive and waiting for a government that had already decided to abandon them. The reason was buried in the bureaucratic language of the final paragraph. Strategic considerations. Post-war tribunal implications, potential embarrassment to Allied command. In other words, bringing these men home would require admitting that certain negotiations had taken place, certain agreements had been made, certain compromises had been accepted. Better to let them stay missing. Better to let the families grieve. Better to bury the truth on an abandoned ship on a forgotten island. Carter closed the folder and lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere out there, those men were waiting. Somewhere out there, families were waiting for news that would never come. And he held in his hands the only proof that any of it had ever happened. The smart thing would be to burn it. Follow orders. Stay quiet. Survive. But Carter hadn't joined the army to do the smart thing. He'd joined because his country was at war and someone had to fight. He'd stayed because the men beside him were worth fighting for. And now he had to decide if he was willing to fight for men he'd never met, for families he'd never know, for a truth that no one wanted him to tell. In the bunk below, someone was snoring softly. Outside, the base was settling into its nighttime rhythm. guards changing shifts, trucks moving supplies, the constant background noise of war winding down. In a week, maybe 2, Japan would surrender officially. The war would be over, and with it, any chance to bring those men home would disappear forever. Carter made his decision. Tomorrow, he'd find a way to get the folder to someone who could use it, a reporter maybe, or a senator, someone outside the chain of command, someone who couldn't be silenced with a transfer order or a closed file. It would probably end his career. It might end up with him in prison. But those men in the hold, those voices calling out from the darkness, they deserved better than silence. He fell asleep with the folder under his pillow and woke to shouting. The shouting came with fists pounding on the barracks door. Carter was awake instantly, his hand reaching under the pillow for the folder before his eyes fully opened. The clock on the wall said 04:30. Too early for reveille, too early for anything except trouble. "Sergeant Carter," a voice barked from outside. "Open up, now." Around him the squad was stirring, men sitting up in their bunks, confusion turning to alarm as they recognized the tone. Hayes swung his legs over the side of his bunk, already reaching for his boots. Jackson was on his feet, his eyes meeting Carter's in the dim light. Carter shoved the folder under his mattress, a temporary measure that wouldn't fool a serious search but might buy him seconds. He moved to the door, straightened his shirt, and opened it. Major Hensley stood outside with 4 MPs, the same ones from yesterday. Behind them, Carter could see more soldiers spreading out across the compound, moving with the kind of precision that said this wasn't about one sergeant and one folder. This was bigger. "Sergeant," Hensley said, his voice tight, "you're coming with me. Get dressed. You have 2 minutes." "Sir, what's this about?" "You have 2 minutes," Hensley repeated. He stepped aside just enough for Carter to see past him. At the other end of the compound, Hayes's barracks was already surrounded. So was Jackson's. They were rounding up the whole squad. Carter turned back to grab his boots, his mind racing. They knew. Somehow they knew he'd taken the folder. Maybe they'd counted the files in the trunk. Maybe the captain had noticed it missing. Maybe someone had seen something during the debrief. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that in about 30 seconds, they'd tear this barracks apart and find exactly what they were looking for. Walsh was standing now, his face pale. Williams had his hands clasped together, lips moving in silent prayer. Lewis watched from the corner, his expression unreadable. Carter laced his boots slowly, buying time he didn't have. His eyes moved to the window, to the latrine building 50 yards away, to the jeeps parked near the motor pool. No clear path, no easy exit. And even if he ran, where would he go? They were on a military base in the middle of the Philippine Islands. There was nowhere to hide that they wouldn't find him. "Time's up," Hensley called. Carter stood, straightened his uniform, and walked to the door. As he passed Williams's bunk, he let his hand trail across the frame, fingers brushing against the small gap between the mattress and the wall. Williams's eyes flicked to the movement, then away, his face showing nothing. Outside, the pre-dawn air was thick and heavy. The MPs formed up around Carter, not quite touching him but close enough that escape wasn't an option. As they marched across the compound, Carter saw the rest of his squad being assembled near the headquarters building. 6 men standing at attention, surrounded by enough MPs to guard a general. They were taken to separate rooms. Carter ended up in an interrogation space he'd never seen before, windowless and small, with a single table and 2 chairs. Hensley sat across from him. The captain from yesterday stood by the door, still nervous, still with his hand near his sidearm. "Let's make this simple," Hensley said. He placed a briefcase on the table, opened it, and pulled out a folder. Not the folder Carter had hidden, but one just like it. "Where is it?" "Where is what, sir?" "Don't insult my intelligence, Sergeant. You were in that hold for 40 minutes. You opened that trunk. And when we inventoried the contents, one file was missing. A very specific file. One that you have no authorization to possess and no business reading." Carter kept his face neutral. "Sir, I don't know what you're talking about." Hensley leaned back, studying him. "You know what's interesting? I've been doing this for 3 years now, cleaning up messes, making problems disappear, and I've learned something about men like you. You think you're doing the right thing. You think you're some kind of hero exposing the truth, standing up for what's just. But you know what happens to heroes, Sergeant. They get other people killed. He opened his folder, pulled out a photograph, and slid it across the table. It showed a woman and 2 children standing in front of a small house. The photo was old, creased, but the faces were clear. Private Morrison's family, Hensley said quietly. Wife and 2 daughters. They've been waiting 3 years for word. 3 years of not knowing if he's alive or dead. Now, let's say hypothetically, that file you don't have contains information suggesting he might be alive. And let's say that information gets out, gets published, makes it to Congress or the newspapers. You know what happens then. Carter stared at the photograph. I'll tell you what happens. Diplomatic channels explode. The Japanese deny everything. Our own command denies everything. And Mrs. Morrison and her daughters get dragged through months, maybe years of false hope, while investigations go nowhere and leads dry up. And at the end of it all, she still doesn't have her husband back. She just has more questions and less peace than she started with. Hensley pulled out more photographs, more families, more faces waiting for news. That's what your truth looks like, Sergeant. You're not saving anyone. You're just spreading the pain around. Carter's jaw tightened. With respect, sir, those men deserve to be brought home. Which men? The ones in the file. You think they're still alive? That ship sat in that harbor for 3 weeks, Sergeant. 3 weeks while we processed surrenders and counted prisoners and sorted through the mess of half a dozen POW camps across the Pacific. If those men were alive and waiting to be transferred, we'd have found them by now. Unless someone didn't want them found. Hensley's expression hardened. You're way out of your depth here. This isn't about one ship or one transfer or one convenient scandal. This is about holding together an alliance that's barely survived the war. This is about not undermining the surrender negotiations. This is about protecting information that, in the wrong hands, could start the next conflict before we finish the current one. He stood up, gathered his photographs, and closed his briefcase. Last chance, Sergeant. Tell me where the file is. We make this go away quietly. You get reassigned stateside, honorable discharge, maybe even a medal for your service. Your squad goes home. Mrs. Morrison and the others keep their memories and their grief and their dignity. Everyone moves forward. And if I don't, then we search your barracks, we search your squad. We tear apart every inch of this base until we find it. And when we do, you and every man who helped you goes up on charges. Theft of classified documents. Insubordination. Conduct unbecoming. You'll spend the next 5 years in Leavenworth while your squad gets dishonorably discharged and sent home with nothing. No benefits, no honor, nothing. The room fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation and the distant sound of the base waking up. Carter thought about the folder wedged behind Williams's mattress. Thought about Hayes and Walsh and Jackson and all the others who'd trusted him enough to follow orders that weren't quite orders. Thought about those faces in the photographs, waiting for news that might never come. And he thought about something else. Something Hensley had said that didn't quite fit. You said the ship sat there for 3 weeks, Carter said slowly. Hensley's eyes narrowed. That's right, but the manifest was dated 4 days ago, the last entry. The one about final evacuation. Hensley didn't answer, but the captain by the door shifted his weight just slightly. Just enough. Carter leaned forward. You already knew where they were. You knew about the transfer, you knew about the prisoners. And you were there. Not just yesterday. You've been there the whole time, haven't you? Watching that ship. Waiting for someone to find it, or waiting to make sure no one did. Sergeant, that's enough. That's why the coordinates for the supply drop kept changing. That's why our radio went out. That's why you knew about the ship before we called it in. Because you led us there. You wanted to see what we'd do. You wanted to see if we'd follow orders or if we'd dig too deep. The room went very quiet. Carter sat back, understanding settling over him like a weight. This whole thing, the abandoned ship, the perfect timing, the convenient evidence. It was a test to see who could be trusted to stay quiet and who needed to be handled. And we failed, Carter said. No, Hensley replied. his voice tired now, almost sad. You passed. You found exactly what you were supposed to find. You asked exactly the right questions. You proved you were smart enough to see the truth and loyal enough to your men to want to protect it. That's valuable. That's the kind of sergeant the Army needs in peacetime. Someone who knows when to speak and when to stay silent. He moved toward the door, then paused. The file doesn't matter, Sergeant. It never did. Everything in it is going to be classified for the next 50 years. And by the time anyone declassifies it, everyone involved will be dead, including the prisoners, including their families, including you and me. That's just how this works. So what happens now? Carter asked. Now you make a choice. You can give me the file and go home a hero, or you can hold on to it and go to prison knowing that nothing you did changed anything except ruining your life and the lives of your men. Hensley opened the door. The captain followed him out. The door clicked shut, leaving Carter alone in the small room with a decision that wasn't really a decision at all. They kept him there for 6 hours. No food, no water, just him and his thoughts, and the growing certainty that Hensley was right about one thing. The truth wasn't going to save anyone. It was just going to hurt different people in different ways. When they finally let him out, the sun was high and brutal. His squad was sitting on the barracks steps, still under guard but no longer in custody. They looked up when he approached, their faces asking questions they couldn't voice aloud. Carter sat down beside Hayes. After a long silence, he spoke quietly. The folder's gone, turned it over, case closed. It was a lie. The folder was still behind Williams's mattress, still hidden, still waiting. But it was the lie that would keep his men safe. The lie that would let them go home. The lie that would allow them to forget they'd ever seen those letters, those names, those faces waiting for someone to care. Hayes nodded slowly. Then he asked the only question that mattered. You think they were still alive, Sarge? The men from the ship. Carter watched a jeep roll past, kicking up dust. I think someone knew. Whether they were alive or not, someone knew and decided it was easier to let them stay missing. That's cold. Yeah. Carter stood up, brushing off his pants. But that's how it works. That's how it's always worked. Over the next week, the squad was processed for stateside deployment. They were given medals for their service, commendations for their conduct, and very specific orders about what they could and couldn't discuss regarding their final patrol. By the time they boarded the transport ship home, the abandoned vessel had been scuttled in deep water and the island reclassified as an active hazard zone. Carter kept the folder. He'd moved it 6 times in those final days, staying one step ahead of the searches he knew were coming. He wrapped it in oilcloth and buried it in his sea bag under dirty laundry and spare boots. He carried it home like contraband, like stolen hope, like a truth too dangerous to speak but too important to forget. Years later, after the war had faded into history and the parades had ended and the medals had been tucked away in drawers, Carter would take out the folder sometimes. He'd read the names. He'd think about the families who'd never gotten their answers, about the men who'd written those letters home, about the choice he'd made to keep quiet instead of speaking up. And he'd wonder if Hensley had been right, if the truth really would have just caused more pain, if silence was sometimes the kinder option. But then he'd remember standing in that hold, surrounded by all those voices calling out from the darkness, and he'd know that some truths couldn't stay buried forever. Maybe not in his lifetime. Maybe not for 50 years. But eventually, someone would open the right file in the right archive and those names would come to light. And maybe, just maybe, someone's grandchild would finally understand what happened to the grandfather they never met. Carter died in 1987, 42 years after stepping off that abandoned ship. The folder was found among his effects, passed to his daughter, who passed it to a historian, who passed it to an archive, where it sits today in a box labeled Pacific Theater, miscellaneous, awaiting someone curious enough to read it. The names are still there. The letters are still there. The truth is still there, waiting.